Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project with E.C. Sinkowski. My name is Patrick Cummings. In every episode, I have the distinct privilege of presenting EC with a question on subject matters that range from nutrition to fitness to the choices we can all make to live a healthier, more functional life. By exploring both the principles at play and the actions worth carrying out as a result, we aim to get you thinking, get you moving, and get you taking more consistent steps toward optimizing your well-being. Thank you so much for tuning in. How are you, EC?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm going to finish all my sentences like that. That won't be annoying.
Perfect.
We're going to dive into a conversation today. I'm excited about this on the carnivore diet, right? This is one of the new hot, everybody needs to do it diets. So I'm excited to hear your thoughts on it. And this is obviously on the back of the conversation we just had related to animal or plant-based diets and the animal plant-based diet that you recommend. Before we get into the conversation though, you are opening up some one-on-one nutrition counseling spots. Why don't you tell folks about that?
Correct. Just opening up a few spots a month to do one-on-one work. And to be honest, it's just going to follow how I do the masterclass progression. You know, it's a lot of what I talk about, establishing a baseline level of quality in the diet with the 800 gram challenge, moving on to adequate protein with lazy macros, and then looking at macros overall. So really, this is just another option for people that has a little bit more interaction with me than the masterclass, of course, because it's one-on-one. I think the masterclass is wildly effective, but for various reasons, some people may choose to have a little bit more one-on-one time with me and also be kind of more on their schedule than necessarily kind of the masterclass group format. So if people are interested, they can email me at info@optimizemenutrition.com. We can talk about some details and determine if it's a good fit for them.
And do you have them do the carnivore diet right at the start or towards
Yes.
the end?
We start off with that, really get the basics in place first.
All right, awesome. Carnivore diet. My exposure to it was through the author Jordan Peterson and his daughter, Michaela Peterson. That was the first time it kind of like popped up on my radar. I don't know that I've dug any deeper than that. I'm going to assume that folks haven't also are kind of the same speed I'm at, where it's like, okay, yeah, you get it. You eat a lot of meat, right? So let's get some background on what is the carnivore diet? What are the constraints of it? What are the confines? And then we can kind of get into your thoughts on it and all that stuff.
It's interesting that you brought up that story because the author of the Carnivore Code, Paul Saladino, actually, that was how he got introduced to the diet that he then, has written this book on. And I don't know if he's the only one who kind of has the body of work about it. To me, as far as I understand, he's the main kind of proponent of it as he's written the Carnivore Code in the last year. But yeah, he heard about Michaela Peterson and he switched to a carnivore diet and had some success. So what's interesting about that is he had an interview with Savan of former CrossFit Media in the last couple months, and he's kind of updated his opinion. So we want to take a look at kind of what he recommended in the book, which is, 100% animal-based diet, in addition to what he now says he practices or believes or subscribes to. And I really wanted to tackle this specifically from our last podcast because I, of course, recommend the 800 gram challenge, which has a few plants in it. And so this isn't just going to be from the perspective of like, are we getting enough nutrients as we mentioned, but he actually takes the position that plants are harmful. And so I kind of wanted to address some of the quote science around that. But I thought it was also a good time to address what I would consider a phenomenon I see in kind of mainstream diet books, because that's really a classic question I get from people is what books do you recommend, right? So I thought it kind of, we'll cover some different topics really specific to this Carnivore Code book that we weren't really capturing, let's say, in the last episode.
Got it. Okay, so where do you want to start then? Does it make sense to start with that book? What'd you call it, the Carnivore Code?
The Carnivore Code. Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense to kind of start with this idea of like mainstream diet books. I certainly get a lot of questions, as I mentioned. People, what should I read? What books do you recommend? Yeah. And I love that people want to read more and learn. It pains me that my recommended list is so short. It's one right now. It's The Hungry Brain by Stefan Guyenet. And I'm sure there are other good ones out there. I don't want to say there's one good book out there. I just, haven't gotten through them all. But in my opinion, a lot of these mainstream books, they kind of follow the same recipe. They kind of have the same parts to them. And they're really, in my opinion, hard to read. And kind of the format or the things to look out for in these books is kind of the marketing ploy, the anecdote, how they blame conventional medicine, and then what they use as science. And so I kind of wanted to go through those areas and explain where I have some problems with that.
Love it. Let's start with the first one there, the marketing.
The marketing. With a lot of these books.
For those folks you can't see the video, but if you just saw her face, I think she just told you everything you need to know.
You need to know. A lot of these books, and I fell for it too. I was reading all of these mainstream books in my early CrossFit days and freaked out about every single thing I thought I knew was true. It's true of the Carnivore Code as well. You are in a marketing ploy. And I have to quote this, Patrick. Here we go. This is directly from the book. Quote, "So now I ask you, do you want to be radically healthy? Do you want to have endless energy, mental clarity, a rocking libido, a sexy physique, and emotional resilience? Ultimately, this book is an adventure story. It's the narrative of my own personal search to rediscover the code that will allow all of us to thrive in ways few of us thought possible. I've been looking for this piece of treasure for many years, and I think I've finally found it. With that said, the time has now come, brave adventurers. Let's begin our quest to find the lost user manual, crack the code, and become radically healthy humans." End quote. Okay, Patrick. Favor.
Yes.
If I ever sound like this on the podcast or write an Instagram post like this, it is time to pull the plug for me. Like, end it.
Got it.
Passion is not evidence. And we fall for this all the time because people are attracted to passion. We talked about this, how the fact that it's really difficult to be interesting and right in the Best Diet of the Year podcast. And I get it. And you want to be attracted to passion and people that are really excited. But when you're reading books like this, it's just a lot of hype. And as soon as I see stuff like this, I am pretty sure they're trying to be interesting and they won't be right. Or at least they're not telling you the whole picture in terms of the data, right? And why? It's to get you excited. It's to get you passionate about the story that is to come. It's marketing 101, right? Like, I am not a marketing person, but any marketing person I have talked to, they tell you to tell a story. And he even tells you that quote, right? He like, "This is my adventure story." He's saying that out loud to you. And so from the beginning of this, I was like, okay, the science is going to be on the back burner.
Okay, so the next one then is the anecdote. Anecdote. Sorry.
Anecdote, yeah.
Not the antidote, the anecdote.
Right, the anecdote. A lot of these diet books are littered with these anecdotes, right? And I found it true to be in the intuitive eating book as well. I mean, you could not get past a page without the story about Sally and how she's made all these improvements. And what's interesting about that is if you've read more than one of these diet books, is all of these books have them. It's like, I switched my diet to intuitive eating. I switched my diet to paleo. I switched my diet to carnivore, and poof, whatever condition I had magically went away, right? Like, everything is now perfect. But if every book has these anecdotes, right? Like, how do we reconcile the fact that like different things are working? How do we reconcile the fact that some people have these effects when they go vegan or keto or paleo or carnivore? And these books don't really acknowledge that's happening. And that's what I try to do with my 10 principles. And I'm not saying that I have nailed everything perfectly, but that's what I'm trying to say is like, what are the underlying principles to all of this? And so his main anecdote is that he had a several-year battle with severe eczema, and he was vegan at the time. And then once he switched to carnivore, everything resolved. And I sort of love that, right? Like, one extreme to the other. I mean, I think maybe that's better evidence that there were some weaknesses in his vegan approach than strength for the carnivore diet, because at the extremes we have issues, right? I also think it's interesting that he mentions that his eczema was really bad when he was in medical school. So he was, and he even uses the words like it was the most grueling part of my medical school time and training. Maybe this is better evidence of the fact that there's very real effects of stress on your overall health picture, right? Not necessarily that, the carnivore diet is best. And so the problem with all of these anecdotes, especially when the author also tells us that they're so well grounded in science. I mean, they've sort of missed what's known, like the famous quote, the famous assertion that the plural of anecdote is not data. Meaning, just because you have 5 people who switch to a diet and have success doesn't mean that the carnivore diet works. What it means is that there's something in their diet, there's something in their lifestyle, or even something has happened with their immune system during the period at which they ate carnivore that worked. And so the nuance is that there could be other things, right? It could be a caloric reduction. It could be an increase in micronutrients. It could be decreased stress. It could even be, and this is a possibility that no one likes to acknowledge, that your immune system actually started to work against that problem at the same time that you switched. It would have happened on its own. This happens all the time. Things clear all the time on their own. Things sometimes, eventually go away. And so this is why we do the controlled experiments. Which factor is it? Because we want to recommend the right aspect. Like, I don't want to tell everyone to do carnivore if it really was because the calories were reduced or really because he got more vitamin B12,
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay, so the third one there was the doctor blame game.
Yeah, I mean, super classic in these kind of like, these books that are these new diet approaches that the conventional medicine system is terrible and the doctors just want to give you a pill and they don't want to actually help with your health. And I think my listeners, our listeners know kind of how I feel about this, but briefly, I just want to rehammer the fact that like, even if your doctor took those 15 minutes once a year to talk diet and lifestyle with you, even if like that was the main amount of time they spent with you and they were asking you what you had for breakfast, I'm very confident that our nutrition situation would be the same as it is, right? Like if 15 minutes of education was all it took once a year, I wouldn't have a business, right? So I think it's sort of assuming that that's going to be so radically different. The other thing though that I want to point out, and somebody commented this on my Instagram, I don't know if it's a famous quote or not, but health is simple, disease is complex. Like I don't want my doctor talking to me about nutrition. When you are sick, when you have a legit condition, heart abnormality, cancer, infection, you're going to be really glad your doctor isn't telling you to go home and eat a steak. Like they have a skill set that is useful. We want them for that skill set. And so I'd prefer that we quit blaming them. Now, are there problems with nutrition in the US? Yeah. Whose responsibility is that? I don't, that's a much more difficult question to solve, right? The final thing I want to say about this in the doctor blame game is that he makes the point that doctors really aren't trained in nutrition. And he, by the way, was a physical assistant, PA, and then went on to an MD degree. So he definitely has a lot of training in the conventional medicine, right? And became an MD. So he's saying that, hey, during the training, we don't really focus on nutrition. But then he goes on to become a nutrition expert, right? Without formal training in nutrition. And it's not particularly clear that he's done all this coaching with people in nutrition either. And so it's like, you're kind of telling us that you have all this experience and education in an unrelated field. I love MDs and DOs, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily so well versed in nutrition right now. Surely they can be, but like I'd want to see that somebody also has specific training or experience, just like I want to see that my doctor, has significant training or experience.
Does that lead us then to the fourth, the science?
The science.
What I would probably think that you would think should be the first, but it seems to be the last.
I mean, they kind of take you through this emotional introduction, Patrick. Yeah. So I got to get through all those other things because those are the ones that get you all wound up. And then by the time you get to the science, you're going to believe whatever, is the next science, the evidence. And there are a few issues that we're going to have to get into related to this, like toxicity of plants or harmfulness of plants. But again, I want to kind of just generally speak to these mainstream diet books is why they kind of fall apart in the science. The first is the anecdote, which you already mentioned. You can't take your personal experience with eczema and then say like, well, now I have the fix for everyone. The second of this is one of the things that he talks about in the Carnivore Code is that we don't really have long-term evidence for it, which is correct. But then what does he use as his evidence? He uses another anecdote, not just his own personal story, but he uses this like self-experiment for a year by this anthropologist in the 1900s, early 1900s. So it's like he's using another N of one as like all of his evidence. And so what do we find out, as we're going to talk in a little bit, like a year later, he's kind of changed his opinion about whether or not this is so healthy, right? So we have a lot of anecdotal evidence. That's a big problem. The next one, though, what's really true of these books is they take the time to try to explain what good science is. And they always talk about, and we've talked about on the podcast, controlled trials versus association trials, where we have all these association trials and they don't really tell us what's causing what. They don't really prove anything. And that's true. And that's the problem. We have correlation, not causation, as you know. This is true with like fruits and veggies. They're associated with less cancer risk, but that doesn't mean that the fruits and veggies are preventing cancer. And this is true and this is right. And I'm glad they go through this. And we always have to be aware of it. The problem then are these books that kind of go on this diatribe about association studies is that they then cite association studies when they're in agreement with their opinion. Like the whole section in that book on mental health relies on association studies to prove his point. He also cites correlation studies to talk against lectins, which are found in plants, or the importance of creatine, which is found in the the animal-based sources, or when he's citing like the longevity of meat eaters. So it's kind of like, which is it? Are we using these studies or are we not? And if you're going to use them, you're going to want to remind the user of when they are weak. And it turns out that he's not consistent with that. Like when it's for his opinion, he doesn't really let people know, hey, this is an association study. It's not really that good. But then when it's like, you know, against his point, he's like, well, I can discount this because this is an association study. So that really bothers me. It's like teaching science, but only when it's in your favor, right? And the final thing about science, and this is true not just of his book, of other books, but when you go to look up the actual reference, and we're going to go through a couple of these, they either directly refute what they are citing it for, or it's entirely irrelevant for the population reading it. And there's a couple examples of that here for sure.
I think we're going to spend the rest of this podcast just diving into this fourth element here, the science here. But before we do it, because this is a little bit closer to my world, like I'm fascinated by this argument and this formula that you've come up, because I think you're spot on. And I don't think it's just books. I think it's just handy and convenient that you found the formula, right? Because what we're talking about is kind of fascinating. And so we don't have to dive into why it's fascinating, but one of the things that pops in my head is there's an author who I really like. His name's Cal Newport. He writes about work and productivity. So obviously not in this world, but I've heard him talk before about being a writer, writing for a popular mass versus he's also a professor. So like he's got both, he's got hands in both worlds, right? He's writing papers for studies and he's also writing books that sell, you know, millions of copies. And so he's got an interesting perspective. And one of the things he says is like, if you're going to write a book, you have to take a stand against something. You can't write a book if you're writing the book and you're saying, here's what I believe, but it could also be like this. It could also do this, or there's also evidence of this. Okay, now here's the next thing I believe in, but it could also be that, right? Like you can immediately see like that's not an interesting book, and I don't think it's a book that anybody would be able to get through it, both reading or writing. And so that preamble just to say, is this an issue in your mind of books? Are books just a really bad way to express ideas around nutrition or health maybe more broadly? Or is it the sales end of it, the need, the want to sell 2 million books, and therefore then I have to go through this process of selling people on a journey, telling them a story that allows them to put themselves in that journey, and then giving them the kind of the answer to it? Like I'm just really curious, like it's not this individual's fault. It's not the individual author's fault necessarily of the 17
I'm sure
books
the
that you've
editor
read.
suggested some things.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just curious, like, is it an issue of books? Like, should we just stop reading books about nutrition or health or things that are really, as you know, one of the things that I've learned over and over and over again in this podcast is like, shit is complex.
Yeah.
And when you try to oversimplify it, you are losing a lot of you're obviously losing the nuance, but then therefore you're also losing the truth.
Yeah.
And so should we just stop looking for those kind of resources, because they're ultimately not the ideal method by which you deliver the kind of results that we're apparently looking for?
Gosh, I think that brings up so many interesting points. I'm going to try to remember a couple.
You know, a 45-minute question.
No, it's great. I love it. I do think, though, we have to be aware of what sells, just as you mentioned, the marketing. Like the classic storyline of movies, the hero, you know, overcomes the odds and prevails. Like that keeps selling. Like we like that story, right? So in these books, you're going to want to go through this journey of like kind of quest and conquest, and like you know, you come out on top and do all these things. So there's some of that. I think we just have to be aware of that. Like that, I don't know what the underlying reason is why we like that story, but that's what we're attracted to, and it certainly is a story. I think it also comes back to like, you can't be interesting and right. I know I keep overusing that phrase, but I think it's true. I think that this stuff isn't really that interesting at the molecular level. It's quite dry and boring, right? And there isn't really a way to sell that. I mean, like PubMed is not like driving tons of ad revenue. So there's that angle. The last thing, though, that I really wanted to pick up on what you said is like, this stuff is really complicated. I think I did this Instagram post kind of recently that was like, the beginner focuses on the fundamentals, so not to be confused, and the expert focuses on the fundamentals because they know what works. And I think we spend a lot of time in the middle because we're trying to understand why. And then it ultimately brings us back to beginning. And why I bring that up is like, I do think nutrition can be simple in application. I truly do. Eat mostly whole unprocessed foods. Don't eat too much. Full stop. Done. It's when we want to walk around in the weeds of what's happening to our DNA and insulin that it gets really complex. And trying to understand that cannot be done in a simplified way and cannot be done in a marketing gimmicky way. And I think that's what's happening in the books is that we're trying to bridge the gap with the science, which is definitely what I try to do on my podcast. It's hard to do. I don't always do it right, but that's what we're trying to do. And I don't know how well of a bridge it's going to be.
Yeah. Perhaps a conversation for another day. I don't want to derail us too much. Let's get back to where we're wrapping up before I interrupted us with talk of marketing and books.
Great.
The science. It seems to me that the primary argument of the carnivore diet or the 100% animal-based diet is that, at least to some degree, it's that plants are bad, or that animals are so much better than plants that we should avoid plants. Is that I mean, again, oversimplified, of course, but is that roughly where we're at?
Totally. It's the argument that, animals-based foods are more superior to plants. I think we tackled that adequately enough in the last podcast. I just don't think there's evidence that we truly have to go to an extreme and that would be superior. But the issue then is that he also not just says like animal stuff is better. He also says plants are harmful. Right. And so I kind of want to bring up 3 topics related to kind of his claims. The first is understanding toxicity and dose, which I think gets kind of misconveyed in the book. The second one is understanding biochemical markers relative to health outcomes. And the third is using outlier cases as arguments for what the norm should be. And so I think we kind of have to go through those. And I do want to untangle some of the studies there, or use some of the studies there. And the first one there is this understanding toxicity and dose. And this is this claim he has in section 2 of the book where he says like the consumption of plants was a bad idea. So I have to look into this, right? We all know I say fruits and veggies, so got to see what he's saying here. Yep. And when getting to this issue of toxicity and dose, the first rule of toxicology is the dose makes the poison, meaning everything out there, be it water, be it oxygen, can become toxic at a certain level. So this is why we can't get freaked out when a rat study results in cancer. They're trying to find what's the dose that makes the poison, right? What's the dose at which there is a problem? Because we always have to remember everything can be toxic eventually. So we don't want to think yes, no on things. We want to think how much. So in this part, he cites an article by Bruce Ames. Bruce Ames is a famous biochemist who's now 92 years old, and he's famous for what he developed called the Ames test, and it's been used in labs to assess whether or not a chemical is mutagenic, meaning changing your DNA, or carcinogenic, causing cancer. So it's somebody who's been working with understanding dose, toxicology, cancer for some time. And the Carnivore Code author cites this 1990 paper called Dietary Pesticides, 99.99% All Natural. And it's from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And this paper is really cool. I'm actually glad that I found it by reading this book. But the point of the paper is that Ames is saying that the doses of pesticides that we are exposed to in terms of synthetic pesticides sprayed on our crops that people are all worried about is actually much less than the dose of pesticides that naturally occurs in plants. He estimates that Americans eat 1.5 grams of natural pesticides each day in their fruits and veggies because plants have these compounds to kind of kill off insects and stuff. So he says that we eat about 1.5 grams of natural pesticides a day. And that's about 10,000 times more than the synthetic pesticide residue on fruits and vegetables. Now, people, I'm sure, are actually getting quite nervous when they hear that. But we have to remember dose, right? And so the Carnivore author uses this to say, oh my gosh, there is so many pesticides in fruits and veggies. It's 10,000 times more than the synthetic pesticides that we're so scared of. And so he's kind of pulling out that argument from it. What he fails to tell you is that Ames, the author, also states this, and this is a direct quote: "It's not argued here that these dietary exposures are necessarily of much relevance to human cancer. Indeed, a diet rich in fruits and vegetables is associated with lower cancer rates." End quote. So Ames is more arguing the fact that, like, wow, our exposures of synthetic pesticides might not actually be that bad, where the author of the Carnivore Code is pulling it out to say, gosh, plants are toxic. And what's really interesting is that this article has 2 companion articles that Ames also co-authored. And I don't really think the Carnivore Code author decided to read those either. Same journal, same year. This one's called Nature's Chemicals and Synthetic Chemicals Comparative Toxicology. And here's a direct quote. Synthetic pesticides have markedly lowered the cost of plant foods, thus increasing consumption. Eating more fruits and vegetables and less fat may be the best way to lower risks of cancer and heart disease other than giving up smoking. End quote. So you could choose not to believe Bruce Ames's opinion here in these articles, and that's up to you and understanding the science. But the main point here is Paul Saladino, the author of the Carnivore Code, directly quotes from an article to show you that plants are harmful, yet the author's true opinions are that people should be eating more fruits and vegetables, right? Like, that's cherry picking. That's disingenuous.
Okay, so let's dive into the second one, the understanding biochemical markers versus health outcomes.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this in the biohacking podcast, but when we look at these health markers, we always have to know what happens in terms of death and disease. And a lot of these studies are looking at the cellular level. What molecule is causing what thing? And the marker that Paul Saladino uses in his book, he often likes to look at oxidative stress, which can cause damage to your DNA. Okay, damage to the DNA, not ideal, right? If we have damaged DNA, we don't make cells the right way, we don't make proteins the right way, we don't make hormones the right way. And we talked about why this damage can occur in the inflammation podcast. But basically, when we create energy to go for a run, to have a heartbeat, just sitting around, being ourselves, when we create energy to live, we create these molecules called free radicals, and they can damage the DNA. He ends up citing basically 3 or 4 articles kind of throughout the book. He uses them often. And these studies are looking at fruits and vegetables and then looking at kind of DNA damage. What he doesn't tell you, though, is that every single day, just by you sitting around producing energy to have your heartbeat, to go for a run, that you have 10,000 interactions of these free radicals to your DNA per cell. Every single day, you have this kind of magnitude of interactions of these molecules with your DNA. It doesn't give you the scale that this is a natural process occurring all of the time, and that these markers are really hard to understand what is going on. And that's exactly what the scientists are trying to do. They're trying to be like, okay, well, this thing measures DNA damage. What does that mean in terms of death and disease? Like, do the molecules in the carrots really protect us from the damage? Are they the ones that are stopping any sort of death and disease? And their conclusions in these articles are not that we should stop eating fruits and vegetables. Their conclusion is we don't actually know what's going on. The authors are like, this is really interesting. We see that when people eat fruits and vegetables, they have a lower risk of death and disease. Yet when we go in to understand the DNA markers, it doesn't necessarily look that those specific compounds are the protective ones. This is interesting. And so when Saladino says that there's no evidence that plants or fruits and vegetables are beneficial in interventional studies, it's like, well, I guess he missed all the randomized control trials with the Mediterranean diet, right? Like, oxidative stress and DNA markers are interesting, but they're not really predicting death and disease as well as kind of these known other things that we're looking at, like markers for diabetes and cholesterol, and actually looking at people eating whole diets. And so this happens all the time, though, in these mainstream books, is they pull out these specific studies that are mechanistic studies looking at a specific biochemical marker and then don't give you the context.
The next one is using outlier cases for the norm.
Right. And this is classic, too. This happens in kind of paleo type books, is they'll pull out these reports that people had either some health condition or even death by eating certain compounds, because this is their evidence that plants are so toxic. And one of them, he has a whole chapter called Attack of the Oxalates. Now, oxalates are naturally found in plants. They can bind to minerals like calcium. If you eat too many, you might have kidney stones. Notice I just said if you eat too many. But anyway, he also goes on, and he has a whole chapter, so he uses different, these toxicology reports. But he does have a part, quote, in extreme cases, kidney damage due to oxalates has also been reported due to excess consumption of peanuts. And he has a citation for that one. So I'm like, okay, this is interesting. Are peanuts killing us, right? This is by Park et al. In 2014, titled Peanut-Induced Acute Oxalate Nephropathy with Acute Kidney Injury. And so it's this report of this 44-year-old man who had acute kidney injury after eating peanuts. And of course, at first you read the book, and even if you go to check the study, you're like, oh my God, this is crazy. Like, I'm going to hurt my kidneys by eating peanuts. Mm-hmm. The first thing about these kind of toxicology case reports is you have to remember why something is published. Research tends to have a bias for anything that's new or different. It's just kind of like a newspaper. Like, you're not going to keep reporting like everything's going fine today. Like,
fruit's still good for you.
Fruit's still good for you. Like, you don't get a lot of interest, right? So you kind of want to think about the literature the same way, because they're trying to show something novel or different or be too aware of. Like, can you imagine the number of case reports we would have in a journal if they were going to tell us every time somebody ate peanuts and was fine? Millions of articles per day, right? So no, we get like the crazy extreme outliers, okay? So that's the first thing to know, is like these toxicology reports exist so that doctors or scientists can be like, wow, this is really interesting and rare. Like, what do I have to know about the kidney, But I also want to read you this part about this individual who had acute kidney injury, because again, Saladino's using this evidence to suggest to you that peanuts are harmful. And this is what he's using. And so this 44-year-old man visited the emergency room. He had persistent vomiting and diarrhea. He had been diagnosed with diabetes, hypertension, and coronary artery disease several years ago. He had normal renal function all when he was, several years ago. And they also tell you his medications. He's on a couple blood pressure medications. He's on aspirin, and he's also on a statin for cholesterol. So he comes in and they're trying to figure out, why does he have, this vomiting and diarrhea? So now I'm quoting from this, quote, "He sometimes drank too much, and at the time of 20 days prior to the visit, he consumed 5 bottles of Korean distilled spirits and 20 bottles of beer daily without meals for 5 days. During this period, he only consumed peanuts at 130 grams or more per day. Since then, he started to vomit and had diarrhea. The symptoms worsened for 15 days until the visit," end quote. Okay. 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 So this is the evidence that oxalates in peanuts are harmful. I mean, what you should take away from this article, Patrick, is that you should not consume 5 bottles of distilled spirits combined with 20 bottles of beer a day for 5 days without eating, also combined with the fact that you're on a slew of meds. I mean, like, how relevant is this to anybody? I mean, how relevant is that to cite that to somebody that nuts are harmful? I mean, he uses some other extreme examples. Somebody goes on a green smoothie cleanse. They also happen to have kidney disease, had a gastric bypass, and antibiotic use that kind of changes their context. But it just really bothers me because, like, this is his evidence to tell people that peanuts are harmful. Fails to mention a large amount of alcohol consumption mixed with, medication drugs. So this is the problem with a lot of mainstream books, is taking the stuff out of context to the point where it's no longer relevant to anybody, at least in the mainstream.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you've mentioned it a few times now, the interview he did with Savon, and that he changed his mind, or at least he's evolved his stance.
Yes.
Let's be nice to him and say that.
Yeah.
What, if anything, is worth mentioning as it relates to that, and where maybe he is today versus where he was, let's say, 2 years ago when he started writing the book?
Yeah, it was actually a really interesting interview. I enjoyed watching it. He readily admits that there's some things in the 2020 book that he would like to change, and that he has evolved in his thinking, and he's been really humbled with that process. And I thought that was really cool. I mean, I certainly have made statements or beliefs about nutrition that I don't agree with. And so, like, this is why I don't really like calling people out, because it's like, yeah, like, we're not always going to be perfect or get everything right. So the fact that he admitted that and has changed his mind is really awesome. And it just was cool to see, right? It turns out what he says now, that his diet is animal based, not necessarily like 100% carnivore, and that it's like 70 to 85% meat or organs. I'm guessing that's on a caloric basis, but I don't really know if he also just means meal to meal, because he has like potential concerns about long-term ketosis and staying like super low carb, no carb almost in for a long period of time. And so it's just, again, interesting that, a year and a half later, he's become more moderate, right? Like, if your diet's 70 to 85% meat based, then 30% to 15% is plant-based, right? So he's getting some more moderation in there. But what he says is that he focuses on kind of the least toxic plant foods. He really believes that fruit is something that can be healthy. So we agree there, right? We agree that animal-based and fruit is healthy, which is great. And interestingly enough, he also really likes honey. And he mentioned that he'll even have upwards of 120 grams of honey a day. So I'm like, well, this is not low carb at all. Like now we're definitely moderate, right? So that's interesting to me. It's a much more moderate approach than to suggest 100% carnivore. And what was really interesting, and I really loved his opinion on, is kind of talking about that sugar consumption, right? We've talked about before that fruit is not like uniquely a problem, that it matters the dose of how much fruit you're having, or even honey. Like, so he talks about this, that like, guys, we can't be so dogmatic about carbs. Like, it's not about, just eating fruit or just eating some honey. The dose matters. How much are you having? Yep. And so it's really interesting that he really preaches that and understanding the dose there, but then doesn't kind of translate that to plants, or like, let's say, eating peanuts or something like that. So that was sort of a little bit disappointing to see, that he still believes that there's these kind of idea of least toxic and more toxic plants. Certainly there are some poisonous plants out there that we know of, but like in terms of like, eating peanuts or eating cabbage or kale, like we're okay. Like we can still do this. So I wish he'd come a little bit more moderate on that, but you never know. Maybe another year he'll be on the 800-gram challenge. I can hope.
That'd be awesome. Okay, we can start to wrap this up, but I do have two more things to say or to ask you about the books and marketing. Yeah. The first is maybe not even a question, but just something that popped out at me because I'm thinking about it. You mentioned like, it's great. We evolved his opinion and you've got things that you've used to think that you think.
Totally.
And it strikes me as like, that's actually the problem with the book is that it doesn't allow for the evolution of thought. What it does is it says, here's the truth. And then it doesn't matter if the author disagrees with it in a year because the thing is the thing that's in the water supply now. And we all know that nobody reads the correction. They read the error,
you
right?
Got it.
And so the book makes it almost impossible to evolve very successfully because no matter what, more people are going to have read the Carnivore Code than the 70% Carnivore Code that he writes next. Right? It's just the way it's just the funnel, the way it goes.
Totally.
Less people are going to. So anyways, so that to me is, one strike maybe against the book as a format. But the last question, just to wrap it up, it might be that this is a question maybe that we could actually tackle in a whole episode, but you'll know better than I, which is how do you recommend we read a book about nutrition or health? What, like, you've broken this down in a really nice way, right? You've given us the warning signals to look for. But when you pick up a nutrition book, like, what are the red flags, or what are the, I don't know, is the opposite of a red flag a white flag? No, that's probably not right. What are the signs that, okay, I'm on the right track here, right? I think you mentioned
this is hungry brain.
Healthy, hungry brain. Like something in there was like, okay, I'm going to continue reading this. And then there are some things, if you're not reading it for a podcast or for something like this, where I imagine you would come across and you'd be like, nope, okay, that's one of those books. How do you recommend we start to do that, knowing that we're coming from a less educated place as it relates to education or as it relates to nutrition and health than you are? What can we start looking for to know, is this in that good category, that rare good category versus the, whatever you want to call it, the marketing ploy?
Yeah, I think one is kind of just the story, like how, I don't know, flagrant or how excited the language is that's writing it, right? Like I said, like nutrition can be simple, but it's also not really exciting. It's not this like adventure story, right? So if you feel like you're in a really big story and you're getting really wound up about things, I think it's a good idea that maybe you don't have the whole picture. So that was my big red flag. And as soon as it gets really emotional in a book, I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's fine for a novel. I don't think it's how we should approach nutrition. I think the other big red flag is something that's super extreme, right? Like, wow, I shouldn't be eating all of these broccoli and cabbage. Like, this sounds odd. Like, I don't think anyone said this to me before. I think something like that. Anything that's super restrictive, super elimination. Again, that idea of like everything you thought you knew was wrong type of thing. I would be very wary of that. Like, I just don't think we're going to have a single person come out with this, mainstream diet book that with an idea that we've never heard about or never considered till now.
Right.
Like typically
Right.
our evolution in scientific knowledge is like one small study at a time to try to understand what's going on. But it's not going to be like somebody just randomly came up with like this diet that really is this optimal thing for everybody. And they did it in like a book. Right.
Yep. Right. Because the person who figured that out probably isn't the person who's going to write a book for the mainstream, for the popular masses.
Yeah. Like leading cutting edge science, the people that are winning the Nobel Prize, like, I mean, maybe some of them do. I don't think they have Instagram accounts, you know?
Yep. Fascinating. Okay. I have lots more questions, but we're going to wrap it up there because they're tangents at this point.
I know.
Thank you very much. And that was really interesting. Thank you. Thank you to everybody out there for listening, for leaving your ratings and your reviews. They do help new folks find the show. And if you know anybody, just send them a text and say, hey, you should listen to this podcast.
Yeah.
We'll be back again soon with another episode of The Consistency Project.